Hey Brownie, you ready for some more crackers? So today we're going to talk about fancy, the word fancy. Some people might call having a donkey fancy. Some people might say living in the country and having 4.5 acres is fancy. Some people may say that's just really not. But we're going to talk today about fancy and what that word means and what used to be considered fancy in my world when I was growing up. Now we consider fancy to be like cars, champagne, diamonds, fancy restaurants, fancy vacations. And none of that was ever in my world. But we did have stuff we called fancy. So let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Bonita from Pennies to Dollars and welcome to my channel. If you are new, you are most welcome, and if you're returning, thank you for coming back. Today we are going to talk about how the word fancy has changed over my lifetime and probably over yours. That is a picture of me in the thumbnail. I had fancy little black buckled shoes, a nice new coat, fancy knee socks, and a fancy set of fluffy white earmuffs. That was fancy. And when I grew up, just about anything new or shiny was considered fancy. Now that has changed so much over my lifetime. So I'm going to share with you today some of my memories about things as I grew up, because so many of you can identify with that and you always seem to have so many memories to share of your own. And then I'm also going to share with you a couple of fancy salads. So let's do that next. Here's one of our favorite summer salads. It is baby spinach with slivered almonds, strawberries, sliced apples, and raspberry vinaigrette dressing. Here's another great summer salad. I have lettuce from the garden. I have lettuce from the store. I have tomatoes, carrots, hard-boiled egg with tuna in the center. Absolutely delicious. And I added some craisins to my tuna salad, and that made it so much better. And some celery from the garden. So those are a couple of my favorite salads that we have in the summer, and yes, I consider them fancy. When I worked in the nursing home, putting a glob of tuna salad in the center of a sliced tomato was considered fancy. So now you understand where I'm coming from. But when I grew up, my grandma was an Avon lady. And sometimes for Christmas, I would get like a powder puff with that scented powder. And it had that big puff that you could puff on your body. And that was so fancy. And I absolutely loved those powder puffs. I was so sad when they quit selling those. They also had that liquid perfumed deodorant that you could just dab on you like perfume. And that was also considered a very elegant type of deodorant that was also a perfume. When I got to be older and we started drawing names because all of my brothers were older and they had started getting married, we started exchanging gifts. And for the first time in my life, I got some sister-in-laws because I was the only girl. So I was so excited to get sister-in-laws, and I started getting some fun gifts for exchange. In fact, one year I got a set of undergarments that had the days of the week on each one. Do you remember those? Those were considered really fancy back in the day. We never had any indoor animals, My mom didn't allow animals in the house. She said it wasn't sanitary. And now look at all of us today who would not go without our animals inside the house. And we certainly did not have a fancy house. But my mom considered that animals needed to be outdoors. Growing up, girls would wear hair barrettes and moms would wear bobby pins. That was a big difference between whether you were younger or whether you were older. Women tried to wear the bobby pins where you couldn't see them. And we got our hair done every single Saturday in the living room. We would wash our hair and then mom would put them up in curlers. And that was mandatory to have your hair rolled once a week in those pokey curlers with those stick pins. And sometimes if they didn't get dry before you went to bed, you had to try to sleep in those things. And then you didn't wash your hair again for another week. Curlers was a very normal thing with me growing up, and that made your hair look fancy. Now there's a new word, I guess, called bougie, which I didn't even know what that meant. And some of my adult kids had to tell me what that meant, which it is a new slang word, which means you are aspiring to be a higher class than you actually are. In fact, there is a Goodwill on the fancy side of town that is now considered the bougie Goodwill. And I guess that's what that means, is people are aspiring to be better than they are by buying things at the new Goodwill. I don't know. These things are beyond me because fancy just meant new and shiny when I was growing up. We always had dresses for church. We wore them in choir. We wore them for band performances. That was considered fancy and appropriate. If we had our own nail polish at home where we could do our nails, that was considered fancy. When I got to be in high school, I got my first set of hot rollers. And then at some point, I got a curling iron. But before that, it was always those stickery curlers. When I grew up, every room in our house was this light mint green because after World War II, they had a lot of surplus paint and they thinned it down and they sold it to almost everybody to try to recoup some of the costs, and it also showed your support of our troops. Hospital walls were that color, people's porches, government offices were that color, and when I grew up, every single room in our house was that color. And that was very common to find most houses painted with all of their walls in that light green. Now, fancy in that day just meant clean, it meant freshly painted, it meant everything was taken care of. It meant you were keeping things up. I wasn't allowed to get my ears pierced until I was out of the house. My mom always said that if God wanted holes in your ears, he would have put them there himself. So I had to wait until I was an adult to go and get my ears pierced. The rules were way different for me growing up. I want to share with you in the next few clips some of the crazy little sentimental items that we considered fancy. Let me know if you remember any of these. How many of you remember these little decorative soaps and that these were something really fancy? I remember getting some of these like from my sister-in-law, maybe when I was in high school or junior high as a Christmas present. And I was so infatuated with these little soaps. You didn't use them. You just used them to display. And since this time, I've been given a little pink flamingo. These were in honor of my brother who passed away. He really loved pink flamingos. He said when he retired, his entire yard was going to be filled with pink flamingos. And I have the little palm trees, of course, that I love. Look at this little historic one that I have from 1994. That's the last year that I had a child. My youngest was born then. And then here are some other favorites. I have a little jack-o'-lantern, another pink flamingo. I have a little Christmas soap of Santa Claus and a little moose. But let me know if you remember when little soaps were the craze because they were what was considered fancy. And do you remember when little lockets like this were considered fancy? Do you remember when collecting little salt and pepper shakers was popular and collecting ashtrays from places that you had traveled? This was from my grandparents' era. And when I grew up, most things that were purchased and not homemade were considered fancy. I got hand-me-downs from one of the neighbor girls because we didn't have any other girls in my family, just me. And I would get these lovely dresses with lace that came from stores. And I thought they were so fancy because they were not homemade. Let me know in the comments some of the things that you grew up with that wouldn't be considered fancy today, but they were in your memories when you were growing up. And when my kids grew up, at the holidays, we drank out of these fancy glasses. These actually came from Arby's. 99 cents back in the day. You could buy one at a time until I got a full set of each ones. But even though they came from Arby's, these were considered fancy. And my kids still call them the fancy glasses today. So let's just sit back and relax, and I'm going to drink out of my fancy McDonald's glass. I hope you've enjoyed this walk down memory lane, and I hope to see you in the next video.